The bodyguard grabbed at his arm in front of 400 millionaires and roared two words that cut through the entire ballroom like a blade. Get out! Every head turned, every champagne glass froze midair, and Nathan Hayes, a man who had once carried bodies out of burning buildings, stood completely still. Not from fear, from the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has already survived the worst night of his life. He looked down at his 9-year-old daughter. She was still holding her donation envelope. That's when Ava Kensington walked through the door. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we bring you stories like this one. Real human moments, raw emotion, and the kind of endings that remind you what actually matters. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that ballroom, because you need to hear everything that happened before that door opened. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between an electric bill and a pizza coupon. Nathan Hayes almost threw it away. He stood at the kitchen counter in his work boots, still wearing the dust from a job site in Queens, and he turned the envelope over twice before opening it. The paper inside was heavy, the kind of heavy that costs money, cream-colored with gold-embossed lettering across the top. The Kensington Children's Health Foundation cordially invites you to the annual benefit gala. Saturday, November 11th. The Meridian Grand Ballroom, Manhattan. He read it a second time. Then he set it on the counter next to his coffee mug and forgot about it for 3 days. It was Emma who found it. She was 9 years old and had her mother's eyes. Dark brown, wide, the kind that noticed everything before she said a single word about it. She'd been doing homework at the kitchen table on Thursday afternoon when she spotted the envelope peeking out from under a takeout menu. "Dad," she said, holding it up. "What's this?" "Nothing, Bug. It says gala." She said the word carefully, like she was tasting it. "What's a gala?" Nathan was at the stove, stirring pasta. He didn't turn around. "It's a fancy party where rich people eat small food and feel good about themselves." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Is it for kids in hospitals?" He turned around then. She had unfolded the invitation and was reading it slowly, moving her finger along the lines of text. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was working something out. A small furrow between her eyebrows, her mouth slightly open. "It says the money goes to children's medical research," she said, "for kids who are really sick." "Yeah." "Can we go?" Nathan turned back to the stove. "It's not really our kind of thing, Emma." "Why not?" He didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was complicated. He thought about the address, the Meridian Grand, and what that place looked like. He'd driven past it on jobs. He knew what the people inside looked like. He knew what he looked like, and he knew those two things didn't match. "It's expensive," he finally said. Emma set the invitation down on the table. She didn't argue. She just said, "Okay," and went back to her homework. He thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. Over the next 2 weeks, Nathan noticed things. Emma's ceramic piggy bank, the one shaped like a yellow duck that her mother had painted the summer before she got sick, disappeared from her bedroom windowsill. Emma started bringing her lunch to school instead of buying it. She stopped asking for the good granola bars and started eating the generic ones without complaint. He found the duck bank in the closet one night when he was putting away laundry. He picked it up and shook it. It was almost empty. He stood there for a long moment in the hallway, holding a ceramic duck that weighed nothing. When he looked at the calendar, he counted back to the day Emma had read the invitation. 14 days. He put the bank back exactly where it was. The Saturday of the gala arrived cold and gray, the way Manhattan gets in November when the sky can't decide whether to snow or just threaten to. Nathan wore the best thing he owned, a dark jacket, navy blue, slightly faded at the left cuff from a year of job sites. He'd pressed his shirt that morning. He'd found a tie in the back of his closet, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral 3 years ago. And he'd stood in the bathroom mirror for a full minute before putting it back. He wasn't going to wear the funeral tie to a party. Emma wore a blue dress that still fit from last Easter. She'd brushed her hair herself, which meant it was almost perfect with one section in the back that she couldn't quite reach. Nathan fixed it with 3 bobby pins while she stood patiently at the hallway mirror. "You look nice," she told him. "You look nicer," he said. In her small hand, she held a white envelope. Inside it was $112 in carefully saved bills and coins, wrapped in a piece of notebook paper on which she had written, in her careful third-grade handwriting, "For kids who need it more than me." He'd seen it without her knowing. He hadn't said anything about it. They took the subway. Emma held his hand the whole way. The Meridian Grand was everything Nathan expected, and several things he hadn't. He'd been inside burning buildings. He'd been through training that broke men twice his size. He'd sat in hospital rooms and held his wife's hand while machines counted out her heartbeats. None of those things had made him nervous. Walking through those brass doors with his daughter made him nervous. The lobby alone was the size of a small park. The floors were marble, pale cream veined with gray, polished to a shine that reflected the chandelier above like a second sky. Men in tuxedos moved through the space with the easy authority of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged. Women in gowns that cost more than Nathan's monthly mortgage stood in clusters, laughing at things he couldn't hear. The noise was particular, the kind of ambient sound that money makes. Low, layered, confident. A woman at the registration table glanced up as Nathan and Emma approached. She had the practiced smile of someone who spent a lot of time deciding who deserved it. "Name?" she said. "Hayes. Nathan Hayes." She scanned the list once, then again. Something shifted behind her eyes, not quite suspicion, but close to its neighbor. "I'm not seeing you on the confirmed guest list, Mr. Hayes." "I should be there. Got an invitation a few weeks back." "Do you have it with you?" He didn't. He'd left it on the kitchen counter. The woman's smile didn't disappear exactly. It just became the kind of smile that holds a door half closed. "I'm going to need to verify with our events coordinator. If you'll just step to the side." "We can wait," Nathan said. They waited. Emma stood beside him without fidgeting, holding her envelope with both hands. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The registration table moved on to other guests. Men who handed over embossed cards without being asked. Couples who were greeted by name. Nathan watched all of it from 3 feet to the left, where he and Emma had been asked to stand. He recognized the move. He'd seen it used before. Not at galas, but the principle was the same. Make someone wait long enough, in an uncomfortable enough position, and eventually they leave on their own. No conflict necessary. He didn't leave. What? It was the head of security who finally came. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was built like someone had decided that a wall needed a face. 6'4", broad across the shoulders, with the particular bearing of a man who had been paid to make decisions quickly and question them later. He wore a black suit and an earpiece, and the expression of someone who had already made up his mind before he reached them. He looked at Nathan once, then at Emma, then back at Nathan. "Sir," he said, not unkindly, but not anything else either. "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." "We're guests," Nathan said. "Your name isn't on the confirmed list." "I told the woman at the table, I have an invitation. I just don't have it on me." "Without verification, I can't allow you into the event." Around them, people were noticing the particular quality of silence that spreads through a crowded room when something uncomfortable is happening. Not complete quiet, but a dimming, like someone turned the volume down 2 notches. Heads turned with the careful, practiced subtlety of people who want to watch without appearing to watch. Nathan felt it. He'd spent enough years reading rooms to know when he was being looked at. He kept his voice even. "Can we call someone? Verify it another way?" "We have a process, sir." "I understand you have a process. I'm asking if there's another option." Marcus Webb didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly. The unconscious body language of someone preparing to physically act. He was bigger than Nathan. Most people were. But something in Nathan's posture sits, the particular stillness of it, the way he stood with his feet slightly apart and his hands relaxed at his sides, made Webb pause. Not long, just a beat. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." He put his hand on Nathan's arm. Nathan looked down at the hand. He didn't move. He said, very quietly, "I'd rather you didn't do that." Webb's jaw tightened. He'd been doing this job for 11 years. He had handled investment bankers who turned belligerent and socialites who got hysterical. And once, memorably, a congressman who tried to bribe him with a gift card. He was very good at reading situations. This one was reading differently than he expected. Get out, he said, louder than he meant to. The words came out with more force than the situation strictly required, the way words do when something about the other person has made you slightly uncertain and you're compensating. Sir, you need to leave the premises now. The room went quiet. Not almost quiet, quiet. 400 people in various states of mid-conversation all registered the same thing at the same moment. A large man in a black suit had just told another man, in front of all of them, to get out. The words hit the marble floors and the high ceilings and came back crisp and clear and undeniable. Emma's hand found Nathan's. He felt her fingers tighten around his and he looked down at her. She was looking up at him. Not scared exactly. Something more like watching. Waiting to see what he did. He exhaled once through his nose. He was going to leave. Not because Webb was right and not because he was embarrassed, but because there was no version of this that ended well for Emma, and she was the only thing in the room that mattered. He turned toward the door. That was when Emma let go of his hand and stepped forward. She walked up to Marcus Webb and looked up at him. 9 years old, a blue Easter dress, hair with one section in the back that caught the light differently than the rest. And she held out her white envelope. "Excuse me," she said. Webb looked down at her. Some of the hardness in his face did something complicated. "My name is Emma Hayes," she said. Her voice was clear, a little careful. "I saved this money for 4 months. It's $112. I want to give it to the sick kids." She paused. "Can I still do that, even if we have to leave?" The room was still very quiet. Nathan watched his daughter stand there holding out an envelope to a man twice her height, and he felt something happen in his chest that had no clean name. It was the same thing he'd felt the first time he held her in the hospital, and the last night he'd sat with Sarah, and the morning 3 years ago when he'd had to explain to a 6-year-old why Mama wasn't coming home. All of it compressed into a single moment that he absolutely would not let himself feel right now, in front of 400 strangers. He pressed his back teeth together. Someone in the crowd made a sound. Not words, just a sound. The kind people make when something hits them before they have time to think about it. Marcus Webb was staring at the envelope. A muscle moved in his jaw. He was a man who had been paid to be impassive in difficult situations, and he was working very hard at it right now. "Emma," Nathan started. The main doors opened. Oh, the sound changed before anyone saw her. The doors to the Meridian Grand's ballroom were heavy, gilded along the edges, and when they opened, they moved with a particular slow weight that the people who owned this room understood meant someone important had arrived. A woman walked in. She was 30 years old, which was younger than almost everyone else in the room, and she wore a black dress with the kind of confidence that had nothing to do with the dress. Her hair was dark, pulled back simply. She moved the way people move when they are used to rooms paying attention to them and have decided to neither encourage it nor apologize for it. Ava Kensington stopped inside the entrance. She looked across the ballroom the way you look across a space when you're scanning it, not admiring, just reading. The chandeliers, the crowd clusters, the table arrangement, the stage setup. She was cataloging, the way people do when they're responsible for a room and they arrive and immediately need to know if anything has gone wrong. Something had gone wrong. She saw it before she understood what she was seeing. A break in the normal social geometry of the room, a cluster of people arranged around a point of tension near the main entry corridor. A large man in a black suit. A woman at a registration table with her hands folded in a particular careful way. And a man in a faded navy jacket, standing very still, with a little girl in a blue dress beside him. Ava Kensington went absolutely still. She stood at the entrance to the Meridian Grand Ballroom and looked at the man in the faded jacket and every single thought she had been carrying that evening. The speech notes, the donor conversations she'd planned, the seating arrangement problem that her event coordinator had flagged that afternoon. Every one of them left her. Because she knew that face. She had seen it once, 3 years ago, in a stairwell that was full of smoke, and the man it belonged to had been carrying her toward light and air when she had been completely certain she was going to die. And then he had put her down on the sidewalk, looked at her once to make sure she was breathing, and walked back into the building. She had never found out who he was. She had looked. She had asked. She had hired someone to look for 8 months and eventually been told that it was possible the man hadn't survived, which was the answer she'd been afraid of and the reason she'd stopped asking. But here he was. Standing in her ballroom in a faded jacket, being told to leave by her head of security, while his daughter held out an envelope to a man who wasn't sure what to do with it. Ava Kensington started moving. She crossed the ballroom at a pace that wasn't running, but was close enough that the people in her path stepped aside without being asked. She reached the entry corridor in less than 30 seconds. Marcus Webb had turned at the sound of movement and was watching her approach with the expression of someone who is realizing very quickly that the situation has changed categories. Ms. Kensington, Marcus. She said his name once, not harshly, but with the particular weight of a word that means stop. She looked at Nathan Hayes. He was looking back at her. His expression was, she couldn't quite read it. Not recognition, or at least not the instant kind. He was studying her face with the careful attention of someone who was trying to place something from a distance. I know you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Nathan said nothing for a moment. His jaw shifted slightly. He looked at her the way he had looked at the embossed invitation, like he was reading something twice to make sure he understood it correctly. I don't think so, he said. Not dismissive, honest. 3 years ago, Ava said. The Callaway Tower fire. March. It was a Wednesday. Nathan's face did something. A small thing, barely visible, the way deep water moves on the surface when something shifts below. But Ava caught it. You carried me down 4 flights of stairs, she said. The 8th floor. I was in the stairwell by the east exit. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't breathe. Another small silence. Around them, people were listening. Ava was aware of it and had decided not to care. You put me on the sidewalk, she said, and you went back in. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at Emma. Something private moved across his face and was gone. You're okay, he said finally. Not a question. I'm okay, Ava confirmed. He nodded once, like that was the information he'd needed. Ava turned to Marcus Webb. This is Nathan Hayes. He is my guest. She paused. He is the reason I am standing in this ballroom instead of not standing anywhere at all. Webb's face had gone through several expressions in quick succession and was now settling into something that looked like a man reassessing 11 years of professional judgment in about 4 seconds. His gaze moved from Ava to Nathan and back to Ava with the careful quality of someone doing arithmetic. Ms. Kensington, he said, I wasn't aware. No, Ava said. Neither was I, until 30 seconds ago. She looked at Emma, who was still holding the white envelope with both hands, watching all of this with the wide, observant eyes of a child who is understanding more than any of the adults realize. Ava crouched down to Emma's level. She didn't do it in a performed way, just folded down until she was looking at Emma directly, eye to eye. Hi, she said. Hi, Emma said. What's your name? Emma Hayes. I'm Ava. What's in the envelope, Emma? Emma glanced up at her father once, like she was checking. He didn't say anything. $112, Emma said, for sick kids. Ava looked at the envelope. She looked at Emma. She pressed her lips together for just a moment. Can I tell you something? She said. Emma nodded. That is the most important envelope in this entire building tonight. Ava said it carefully, not in the way adults say things to children to make them feel good, but in the way people say things they actually mean. And I am going to make sure it gets to exactly the right place. Emma considered this seriously. The hospital kids? The hospital kids, Ava confirmed. She stood up. She looked at Nathan. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not suspicious, not grateful, not embarrassed. It was the expression of someone who is processing several things simultaneously and not ready to sort them yet. Would you please come inside? She said. Both of you. Nathan looked at the ballroom, at the 400 people who had watched all of this and were still watching with varying degrees of subtlety, some of them with their champagne glasses frozen at shoulder height. He looked at Emma. Emma looked up at him and said, It's okay, Dad. He exhaled through his nose. Something shifted in his jaw. All right, he said. They walked into the ballroom side by side, Emma between Ava and Nathan, still holding her envelope, looking at the chandeliers with the uncomplicated wonder of a child who has seen something beautiful and has not yet been taught to pretend she isn't. The crowd shifted around them. Conversation resumed, but not the way it had been before. This was conversation with an undercurrent, the low-frequency hum of 400 people quietly recalibrating what they'd just seen. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward the man beside her and said something Nathan couldn't hear. The man glanced at Nathan's jacket and said something back. Nathan caught it anyway. 32 years of reading environments had made him good at that. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the shape of them. He kept walking. Marcus Webb stood at the entrance to the corridor and watched them go. His earpiece crackled once. He reached up and pressed the button to respond, but he didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the back of Nathan Hayes's faded jacket and at the little girl in the blue dress walking next to the most powerful woman in the room, and he was thinking about the two words he had said loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Get out. He pressed the button. Stand down, he said. Everything's fine. He didn't entirely believe the second part, but not because anything had gone wrong, because something had gone more right than he knew what to do with, and he wasn't sure yet what that meant for him. He stood at the entrance to the Meridian Grand Ballroom and watched a man in a faded navy jacket walk calmly into a room full of people who had already decided what he was worth. And he felt, for the first time in a professional career that had been built on certainty, genuinely uncertain about the right things. Emma's voice drifted back to him. She was asking Ava something about the chandeliers, whether the crystals were real, and Ava was telling her yes, she thought so, but honestly she'd never thought to check, and Emma said that was funny because they were so big you'd think someone would want to know. Marcus Webb almost smiled. He didn't, but almost. Nathan Hayes sat down at a table in the Meridian Grand Ballroom in his faded navy jacket with his daughter beside him and a glass of water in front of him that probably cost more to serve than his coffee maker at home. He looked at the room around him, the chandeliers, the people, the stage at the far end with a podium and microphones and the kind of lighting that makes everything look serious. He thought about the invitation on his kitchen counter. He thought about a ceramic duck bank that weighed almost nothing. He thought about a stairwell full of smoke and a woman he hadn't recognized, and a night 3 years ago that he rarely talked about and tried not to think about too much, because the memory of going back into that building had a particular texture that didn't mix well with sleep. Emma leaned against his arm. She was looking at her envelope. Dad, she said. Yeah. She said the most important envelope. Did she mean it, or was she being nice? Nathan looked at the envelope. He thought about 4 months of saved lunch money and a ceramic duck and a 9-year-old who had stood in front of a man twice her size and held out everything she had without flinching. I think she meant it, he said. Emma thought about this. Okay, she said, and leaned back against his arm. The ballroom hummed around them. The evening was just beginning. The table Ava had guided them to was near the center of the room, which was worse than the edges in certain ways and better in others. Worse, because more people could see them. Better, because Nathan could see everything. All 4 walls, both exits, the stage, the main doors. Old habit. He'd been arranging himself in rooms that way for so long it had stopped being a conscious choice. Emma was studying the centerpiece. It was an elaborate arrangement of white flowers and thin gold branches that reached about 2 feet above the table, and she was examining it with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was planning to replicate later in a sketchbook. Nathan watched her reach out and touch one of the petals with a single finger, gently, like she was checking whether it was real. It was real. Everything in this room was real and expensive, and Nathan was aware of both of those facts in the particular way you are when you don't belong somewhere and you know it, even if no one has said it again since the last time someone said it very loudly. Ava sat across from them. She'd flagged down a server, not with the entitled snap some people used, but with a slight lift of her hand, the practiced efficiency of someone who was accustomed to needing things done and had learned to ask for them without performance, and ordered sparkling water for the table and, after glancing at Emma, a small plate of the dessert appetizers that were circling the room on silver trays. You don't have to do that, Nathan said. I know, Ava said. The desserts arrived. Emma looked at Nathan. He nodded once. She took one carefully and ate it in 2 bites with the restrained enthusiasm of a child who is trying to demonstrate good manners and is very much enjoying herself. Ava watched her and the corner of her mouth moved. She's wonderful, she said, quietly enough that Emma, who had found a second dessert to consider, didn't catch it. She's a lot of work, Nathan said. He said it without any softness in his voice, which was how you knew he meant the opposite. Ava looked at him. She had been looking at him in pieces since the moment she'd recognized him in the entry corridor. Checking, verifying, the way you look at something you thought was lost. The jaw, the posture, the particular stillness. It was all the same. 3 years had changed very little about Nathan Hayes on the outside. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to know you don't have to answer it." "All right." "Why did you go back in?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his water glass and set it down without drinking from it. He did this sometimes when he was deciding something. Not stalling, exactly, but the physical equivalent of measuring a doorway before you walk through it. "There were still people inside," he said. "You didn't know that for certain." "No," he agreed, "but I didn't know there weren't." Ava waited. Nathan didn't add anything to that. She got the sense that for him, the sentence was complete, that it contained everything necessary and anything beyond it would be decoration. She thought about 8 months of looking for him. She thought about the night her assistant had sat across from her in her office and said gently that they had exhausted the available leads and perhaps it was time to accept that they might not find out who he was. She had nodded and said okay, and then sat at her desk for 20 minutes doing nothing, which was not something Ava Kensington did. "I looked for you," she said, "for a long time." Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been found doing something they considered private. "I figured no one would," he said. "Why?" He thought about it. "It was a fire. People were scared, a lot of confusion. I wasn't wearing anything that identified me." He paused. "And I left before the reporters got there." "On purpose?" He didn't answer that directly. He said, "I don't like cameras much." Emma had finished her dessert and was now listening in the particular way children listen when they are pretending not to. Facing slightly away, very still, attention completely directed at the adult conversation happening beside her. "Dad went back in a building?" she said, still looking at the centerpiece. Nathan and Ava both looked at her. "Emma," Nathan said, "I'm just asking." She turned and looked at Ava. "Was it really on fire?" "It was," Ava said, after a brief check with Nathan's expression, which gave her nothing definitive either way. "The 8th floor and below. There was a lot of smoke." Emma processed this. She looked at her father. "You didn't tell me that," she said. "It was before you were old enough for me to tell you things like that." "I'm 9. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You are." Emma seemed to accept this as a temporary answer, with the understanding that it was going to be revisited later, at home, when there were fewer people around. Nathan recognized the look. It was the same look Sarah used to give him when she was filing something away for later. He picked up his water glass again. This time he drank from it. Ava watched this small exchange between a father and daughter, the economy of it, the trust encoded in the shorthand, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not envy, something quieter than envy. "Can I ask you something now?" Nathan said. It wasn't phrased like a question, really, more like a statement of intent. "Yes." "How did you—" He paused, and Ava could see him selecting words carefully. He wasn't a man who spoke imprecisely, and he wasn't a man who spoke at length. "You built this." He gestured at the room, the gala, the foundation, the whole apparatus of organized philanthropy around them. "The Children's Health Foundation. All of this is yours." "It is." "That was after the fire?" Ava folded her hands on the table. "The foundation existed before the fire. My family started it when I was 17, but I was running it in name only at that point. I had a staff. I showed up for events. I signed things." She paused. "After the fire, I started actually working. I restructured the entire organization. We went from funding 3 research programs to 11. We built partnerships with 6 hospital networks. The Children's Oncology Ward at Meridian Medical. That's ours now." Nathan was listening without expression, which she was beginning to understand meant he was listening with complete attention. "The fire changed what you did," he said. "The fire changed what I thought I was doing," she said, which turned out to be more important. A beat of quiet between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet between people who are both comfortable with silence, which is rarer than it sounds. "What do you do?" Ava asked. "You said construction when I—" She stopped. Sorry, I was listening to what you told Marcus when you were trying to get in. Project manager? Yeah. How long? 5 years? Did other things before? She knew, from context, what the other things were. The way he'd moved through the crowded entry corridor, the way he stood, the specific quality of calm he'd maintained while a man twice his size told him to leave in front of hundreds of people. She knew without asking. Military? She said. He nodded. Navy? He looked at her. How'd you know Navy? Something about how you looked at the exits when you sat down, she said. My brother was Air Force. He looks at windows. My college roommate's father was Army. He sits with his back to walls. You looked at exits. Nathan studied her for a moment. Navy, he confirmed. SEAL teams, 8 years. When did you get out? 4 years ago. The timeline arranged itself quietly in Ava's mind. 8 years in the teams. Then out. Then the fire a year later, which meant he'd been civilian for approximately 12 months when he'd walked into a burning building as though it were a perfectly natural thing to do. You went back in, she said again, and she meant it differently this time. He caught the shift. He was quiet for a moment. Old habits. Emma had given up pretending not to listen and was now openly watching both of them, her chin resting on one hand, the expression on her face the one she wore when she was watching a movie that was getting to a good part. Emma, Nathan said. I'm just sitting here, Emma said. Could you sit there and look at the flowers? I already looked at the flowers. Look at them again. Emma sighed in a way that was deeply familiar to any parent who has ever asked their child to do something reasonable. She turned back to the centerpiece, but she tilted her head slightly in their direction. Ava pressed her lips together to keep the smile contained. She had a feeling Emma Hayes missed very little. She looked at Nathan Hayes across the white tablecloth and the impractical flowers and the half-eaten plate of dessert appetizers, and she thought about what she wanted to say next and how to say it without it sounding like what it might sound like. She had been doing this her whole professional life, navigating the space between what she needed to say and how it would be received by someone who had reasons to be skeptical of it. I want to say something, she said carefully, and I need you to hear it as I mean it and not the way it might sound. I'll try, he said. I have been carrying that night for 3 years. She kept her voice level and factual. The not knowing who you were. That's a specific kind of weight. And I had made a kind of peace with not finding out, but I had also spent 3 years trying to run this foundation in a way that honored something I couldn't name, because the person I wanted to thank didn't exist anywhere I could find. She paused. And now here you are, in my ballroom, being asked to leave by my security team. Nathan looked at her. A long beat. Life's funny, he said. It was so unadorned, such a plain thing to say in response to what she'd just told him, that Ava laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, the kind that gets out before you decide to let it. Several people at the nearest table glanced over. She didn't care. Yes, she said. It is. Nathan almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, the slight movement at the corner of his mouth, before it was gone. She filed it away the way you file things that feel significant before you know why. Tell me about Emma's mother, she said, and then immediately, you don't have to. No, he said. It's all right. He looked at Emma, who had gotten interested in the centerpiece again, genuinely this time. She was counting the gold branches with her finger, her lips moving slightly. Her name was Sarah. We met when I was stateside on leave. She was a physical therapist. She worked with veterans, actually. That's how we met. Not me specifically. I was at a facility visiting someone from my unit, and she was there. He paused. She was funny. Not in a loud way. Dry. She noticed things, and she made these small observations about them that were so accurate they made you laugh before you realized she'd said anything. He stopped. Ava waited. She got sick about 2 years after Emma was born. Ovarian cancer. She was 31. He said this last part with no inflection whatsoever, which was somehow more devastating than if he'd said it with grief. She died 4 months after the diagnosis. I'm sorry, Ava said. She said it simply, without the over-careful quality that people sometimes brought to those words, as if they needed to package them correctly to be effective. Nathan nodded. Emma was 6. She doesn't remember as much as she thinks she does, but she's put together a picture of her from photographs and things I've told her, and I think the picture she has is pretty accurate. Sarah would have... He stopped. He pressed his thumb against the side of his water glass. She would have liked the flowers. She would have said they were excessive, and then she would have stared at them the whole night. Emma turned around. Are you talking about Mom? Yeah, Nathan said. What about her? That she would have liked the flowers. Emma looked at the centerpiece with fresh evaluation. She would have wanted to take them home. She would have wanted to take half the room home, Nathan agreed. Emma nodded sagely and turned back. Ava found that she had to look at the table for a moment. She moved the edge of her water glass 1 inch to the left and then 1 inch back, which served no purpose but gave her hands something to do. Around them, the gala had reached the phase of the evening where dinner was transitioning into the program. Servers were clearing plates with efficient quietness. And near the stage, a woman with a headset was making small adjustments to a microphone stand. The ambient noise of the room had shifted in texture. The free-roaming conversations were tightening, guests finding their seats, attention beginning to organize itself toward the front of the room. Ava had a keynote speech on a note card in her clutch. She'd written it 3 days ago and refined it twice. It was good. She'd given enough of these to know the difference between a good speech and a going-through-the-motions speech. It covered the Foundation's accomplishments for the year, the new research partnerships, and it included an anecdote about a 9-year-old patient in the oncology ward who had beaten his prognosis and was going home for the holidays. That anecdote always worked. She'd used variations of it before. She looked across the table at Nathan Hayes in his faded navy jacket and Emma Hayes in her blue Easter dress and the white envelope sitting next to Emma's plate. She thought about the speech on the note card. She thought about Marcus Webb's voice, "Get out," and the way the room had gone silent. She thought about what it meant that a man who had carried her out of a burning building was sitting at one of her tables right now because the only reason he'd come tonight was for his daughter. And the only reason his daughter had come was because she'd spent 4 months saving her lunch money for children she'd never met. The woman with the headset caught Ava's eye and held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes to program start. Ava looked at Nathan. Can I ask you one more thing? Sure. When you went back into the building, were you scared? He considered the question with the same seriousness he'd given everything else. Yeah. But you went anyway. Fear doesn't make the decision, he said. You still get to make the decision. Ava was quiet for a moment. What does make the decision? She asked. He thought about it. He looked at Emma. He looked back at Ava. What you can live with afterward, he said. The woman with the headset appeared at Ava's elbow and said quietly, Ms. Kensington, we're ready for you in 4. Ava nodded without looking away from Nathan immediately. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Not dramatically, just long enough to make sure the answer he'd given her was in her hands, and she wasn't going to drop it. Then she stood up. I'll be back, she said. Don't go anywhere. Nathan looked around the room, the 400 people, the chandeliers, his own faded jacket against the cream-colored chair. He looked back at her. Wasn't planning on it. She walked toward the stage. And Nathan Hayes, former Navy SEAL, widowed single father, construction project manager, watched her go and then turned to his daughter and said, You doing okay? Emma had reorganized the dessert plate so that the remaining pieces were arranged in a pattern he couldn't quite decipher. I like her, Emma said. Yeah? She talks to me like a person. You are a person. Dad, you know what I mean, like a real person, not a kid person. He knew what she meant. He also knew it was accurate. Eat your dessert, he said. I arranged it. You can arrange it after you eat some. Emma picked up one of the pieces and ate it without disrupting the pattern, which was a more sophisticated geometric solution than Nathan would have attempted. He watched her do it and thought, not for the first time, that she was going to be fine. Whatever came after this, whatever the world turned out to be, Emma Hayes was going to be fine. He wasn't always sure about himself, but he was sure about her. The lights in the ballroom shifted slightly, warmer toward the stage, dimmer over the tables, and the room's noise settled further. Nathan turned toward the front. The podium was lit, the microphone ready, and the woman with the headset was stepping back into the wings. Around him, 400 of America's wealthiest people settled into their chairs. People who had looked at Nathan Hayes 45 minutes ago and decided, in the time it takes to read a person's jacket, that they understood exactly what he was and what he was worth. He folded his hands on the table. He was not someone who spent a lot of time thinking about what other people thought of him. Life had given him more pressing things to think about, but he was also not unaware. He knew what the last 45 minutes had looked like from the outside. He knew the conversations happening at the tables around him, the recalibrations, the whispered questions about who he was and why Ava Kensington had crossed a ballroom to stop her own security team from removing him. He didn't particularly need them to understand, but he noticed. Marcus Webb was visible near the back wall, standing at his professional post by the main doors. He was doing the things security people do, scanning the room at intervals, checking the exits, remaining present without being intrusive. But at one of his intervals, his scan slowed when it reached Nathan's table, and for just a moment he wasn't scanning. He was looking. Nathan looked back. Webb held it for 2 seconds and then moved his gaze on. Nathan turned back to the stage. Ava Kensington stepped up to the podium. The room settled to quiet around her with the ease of a crowd that was accustomed to paying attention to this particular person. She adjusted the microphone, a small, practical movement, and looked out at the room. And Nathan Hayes, who had not wanted to come tonight and had come anyway, sat in his faded jacket in a room full of people who had already decided what he was. And he listened. He didn't know yet what she was going to say. He didn't know what it was going to mean for the evening, or for the weeks that would follow, or for Emma's future, or for any of the things that were about to shift. He only knew that Ava Kensington was standing at that podium because she was alive. And she was alive because 3 years ago he had made a decision that he hadn't really thought of as a decision, just the thing that needed to happen next. He still didn't think of it as a decision, but sitting in that room, with Emma beside him quietly rearranging dessert into geometric patterns, and the chandeliers burning above them, and 400 people watching a woman take the podium, he understood something he hadn't fully understood before. That the things you do without thinking about being seen are the most accurate version of who you are. Ava looked out at the crowd. She reached into her clutch. She took out the note card with her prepared speech, looked at it for one brief moment, and set it face down on the podium. Then she began to speak. And what she said had nothing to do with the note card. She didn't start with the foundation's numbers. She didn't start with the year's accomplishments, or the research partnerships, or the anecdote about the 9-year-old boy from the oncology ward, the one she'd used 3 times already at events like this because it reliably produced the right kind of emotion at the right kind of moment. She started with a fire. 3 years ago, Ava said, I was on the 8th floor of the Callaway Tower building on a Wednesday evening in March. I was working late. I did that a lot back then, not because I was passionate about what I was doing, but because I hadn't figured out yet what passion actually felt like, and staying busy was a reasonable substitute. The room was quiet. Not the polished, attentive quiet of an audience waiting for a keynote, something rawer than that. The quiet of people who were not expecting this. The fire started on the 4th floor. By the time the alarms reached the 8th, the stairwells were already filling with smoke. I made it to the east stairwell, and I couldn't see anything. I couldn't breathe. I was on the floor, and I had made a decision. Not a brave decision, just the only decision left, that I was not going to make it out. She paused. The silence in the room was total. A man came through the smoke. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask my name or explain what he was doing. He just picked me up and carried me down 4 flights of stairs and out onto the sidewalk and put me down and looked at me once to make sure I was breathing. Another pause. And then he went back in. Nathan was very still at his table. Emma had stopped rearranging the dessert plate. She was watching Ava with the same focused attention she'd given the conversation at the table, but different now. More serious. The way a child looks when something has moved from interesting to important. I didn't know who he was, Ava continued. I looked for 8 months. I couldn't find him. And I eventually had to make peace with the possibility that the man who carried me out of that building might not have made it out himself. She let that sit for 2 seconds. I came to tonight's gala 45 minutes ago and found him being escorted out of this room by my own security team. The sound that moved through the ballroom was not a gasp exactly, more like the room exhaling something it had been holding. A collective release of air that had been compressed since the moment Marcus Webb had said, "Get out loudly enough for everyone to hear it." His name is Nathan Hayes, Ava said. He's sitting at table 7. He came tonight because his 9-year-old daughter wanted to donate the money she saved over 4 months to children in hospitals. She saved $112. I have been to a lot of these events in my professional life. I have seen a lot of donations. I want to tell you honestly that that envelope and what it represents is the most significant thing that has walked into this room tonight. Nathan looked at Emma. Emma was looking at the stage. Her face had gone pink. "Dad," she whispered. "It's okay," he said quietly. "She said my name. She said your number, table 7. Emma thought about this distinction for a moment and decided it didn't change how she felt about it, which was evidently a great deal. Ava looked out at the room. She found Nathan's table without difficulty. The chandeliers threw enough light to read by, and she looked at him directly when she said the next part. "I want to ask Nathan Hayes to come up here." She said it simply, without the theatrical buildup that speakers sometimes use to manufacture significance around an invitation. Not to perform anything, not to be an example of something, just to talk to 400 people who could use what he has to say. The room turned. All of it, simultaneously, the way crowds move when their attention is pointed in one direction, toward table 7, toward a man in a faded navy jacket who was sitting very still and looking at a woman on a stage with an expression that was doing several things at once. Emma turned to her father. He was quiet. "Dad," she said. "I heard her. Are you going to go?" He looked at the stage. He looked at the room. 400 faces, arranged across white tablecloths and candles and the wreckage of dinner courses, all pointed at him with varying degrees of expectation. He had spent 8 years in the teams doing things that required genuine courage, the kind that involves physical risk, darkness, hostile environments, the particular math of deciding that what needed to happen was more important than whether you personally survived it. He had done those things without hesitation. Public speaking was a different category. "I don't do this kind of thing," he said. "I know," Emma said. "But you do other hard things." He looked at her. She looked back at him with Sarah's eyes and waited. He stood up. The room responded with a sound. Not quite applause yet, more like the breath before applause, a collective inhale. He walked between the tables toward the stage with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, not performing calm but simply being it, which was harder than it looked and more visible than he intended. He passed close to the table where the woman in the silver gown was sitting, the one who had leaned over to her companion earlier and said something Nathan couldn't hear. She was watching him now with an expression that had nothing in it of what had been there before. Her hands were folded on the table and she was watching him the way you watch something when you have recently been wrong about it, and you're still absorbing the fact of that. He didn't look at her directly, but he noticed. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage. Ava was at the edge of it, and she handed him a wireless microphone with the practical efficiency of someone who had done this exact move hundreds of times, transferring the room to someone else. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly, close enough that only he heard it. "I haven't done it yet," he said. Something crossed her face, the almost smile again. She stepped back toward the side of the stage, and Nathan Hayes walked to the podium and stood in front of 400 people and a microphone and a light that was brighter than he expected. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. This would have been uncomfortable for most people. For Nathan, it was just calibration, the same beat he took before any difficult thing, the moment of making sure the ground was where you thought it was before you put your weight on it. He looked out at the room. He found Emma at table 7. She was leaning forward slightly with her chin on her hands, watching him the way she watched movies she liked. He looked back at the crowd. "I'm not going to pretend I'm comfortable up here," he said. His voice came out clear and even through the microphone, with the quality of someone accustomed to making himself heard in conditions that made hearing difficult. "So if this goes sideways, that's why." A small, genuine laugh from the room. Not the polite laughter that audiences give speakers as encouragement, but the real kind, the surprised kind. He put one hand in his pocket, the other held the microphone. He didn't look at the podium because there was nothing on it for him. "I'll tell you what I know," he said. "I don't know a lot, but what I know for real." He paused, not for effect, but because he was thinking about where to start. "I joined the Navy at 19 because I didn't have a plan and I needed one. That's the honest version. The story I told people for a while was that I wanted to serve my country, which was also true, But the more primary truth was that I was 19 and directionless, and the military looked like a structure that might straighten me out. It did. I spent 8 years in the teams, and I can tell you it is nothing like what you see in movies. It's mostly waiting and being cold and doing things that are technically beyond what your body wants to do, and trusting people with your life because the alternative is not trusting them, and then everyone dies. That's the whole equation. Trust and show up. Everything else is commentary. The room was very still. He wasn't a storyteller by nature. He didn't have the instinct to shape a narrative or pause for emphasis or modulate his voice to guide an audience's emotional response. But the absence of that instinct was, paradoxically, what made people lean forward. He was just talking. Just saying the things he knew in the order he knew them. I got out 4 years ago. My wife was sick. She needed me home, and Emma needed me home. And the teams is not something you can do halfway. There's no showing up part-time, so I got out. He stopped. Sarah died 8 months after I came home. Emma was 6. And I want to say something about that period that I've never said to anyone except one person who isn't in this room. The silence was the kind that has weight. I was not okay, he said. I want to be specific about that because I think there's a version of this story where a former SEAL loses his wife and handles it with strength and dignity and keeps everything together for his kid, and everyone says that's remarkable. And I did keep everything together for Emma. But I was not okay. I was in pieces for about a year. I functioned because Emma needed me to function, and I'm very grateful that she needed that from me, because I don't know what I would have done with a year that didn't require me to get up in the morning. But there was nothing strong about it. It was just the only option left. He glanced at Emma. She was still leaning forward. She was biting her lower lip slightly. Not with worry, he knew that look, but with the concentration of someone who is absorbing something. I'm telling you that, he continued, because I think people in rooms like this one make a lot of quick decisions about who other people are. I made it into this room tonight with some difficulty, which you may have noticed. A small pause. Several people who had watched the entry corridor scene shifted in their seats. And I understand why. I look the way I look. I'm wearing the best jacket I own, and it's not a tuxedo. I don't own a tuxedo. I manage construction projects. I make a living wage and I own my apartment, and I have enough left over at the end of the month for Emma's art supplies, and occasionally something stupid I don't need. That's my life. And it took me a while to figure out that the word for that isn't not enough. The word for it is enough. Someone at a table near the front made a sound, just a small sound. But Nathan heard it. The thing I know most, he said, is what my daughter showed me tonight. She saved money for 4 months. Her lunch money. Money she could have spent on things 9-year-olds spend money on. She did it quietly, without telling me what she was saving for, and she put it in an envelope, and she brought it here for children she has never met and will probably never meet. And when a man twice her size told her she needed to leave, he stopped. His jaw moved slightly. He looked at Emma. She walked up to him and asked if she could still give her money to the sick kids, even if they had to go. The room was perfectly still. Nathan looked back at the crowd. I spent 8 years learning about courage, he said. That was the most courageous thing I've ever seen. It landed in the silence and stayed there. For 4 seconds, nothing moved. Then a woman at a table near the left wall began to clap, and it spread, not in the wave that rehearsed applause travels, but in the uneven, organic way that real response moves through a room, person by person, reaching the back in about 10 seconds and becoming, by the time it got there, the closest thing to unanimous that 400 people with very different opinions about everything can manage. Nathan stood at the podium and waited for it to finish. He didn't smile. He didn't nod with the practiced humility of someone who has gotten good at receiving applause. He just stood there, slightly uncomfortable, which was the most honest possible response. When it quieted, he said, I want to say one more thing, and then I'll sit down. The room settled. I don't know most of you. You don't know me. We made decisions about each other tonight based on, he gestured, a small movement that somehow encompassed the whole room. The tuxedos, the gowns, the jackets, the jewelry, all of it. Based on the outside of things. That's a human habit. I do it too. But the problem with that habit is that it's almost always wrong about the things that matter. It'll tell you accurate things about money and status and who went to what school. It won't tell you anything true about whether someone is worth knowing. And the things that make a person worth knowing are the things you can't see from across a room. He paused. They're only visible in what a person does when no one's watching, or when someone's telling them to leave. He set the microphone on the podium. "Thank you for letting us be here tonight," he said, and walked off the stage. The standing ovation began before he reached the bottom step. It was not the unanimous kind, but this was a room full of people with varying levels of self-awareness, and some of them started clapping a beat after others, and some stood immediately, and some stood a second later when they noticed others standing, and at least 3 tables in the back remained seated for an awkward moment before social gravity pulled them up. It was imperfect and slightly staggered and real. Nathan walked back toward table 7 through a room that was on its feet, and he kept his eyes on Emma, and Emma was standing up and clapping with an expression on her face that he had to look away from because it was doing something to him that he needed to stay ahead of. He sat down. Emma sat down. She reached over and took his hand across the table and held it with both of hers. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. Across the room, people who had made up their minds about a man in a faded jacket 45 minutes ago were quietly taking those minds apart and reassembling them around different information. This was not a comfortable process for most of them. Discomfort and growth occupy the same space, which is why most people choose one or the other. The woman in the silver gown had her hand pressed flat against the table. She was staring at the surface of it. The man beside her said something and she shook her head slightly, not dismissively, but in the way of someone who doesn't want to talk yet, because they're still inside something. Marcus Webb, at the back of the room, was not scanning exits. He had stopped scanning exits approximately 4 minutes ago. He was standing against the back wall with his arms at his sides and his earpiece silent, and he was looking at the stage where Nathan Hayes was no longer standing, and something in his face had changed in a way that 11 years of professional impassivity had not prepared him for. He was thinking about 2 words. I was thinking about a man who had stood very still in the face of those 2 words, and a little girl in a blue dress who had stepped forward anyway. And he was thinking about the way he'd felt in the moment before Ava Kensington had crossed the room. The slight uncertainty, the thing that hadn't read right. And he was understanding now what that thing had been. He had been right to be uncertain. He had been looking at Nathan Hayes and reading everything correctly, except the most important thing. He reached up and pressed his earpiece once. "All stations," he said quietly. "I'm stepping away from the back wall for a couple minutes. Cover my position." He crossed the room. Nathan saw him coming. He watched Webb navigate between tables with the careful, purposeful movement of a large man trying not to disturb things. And he watched the expression on Webb's face, which was doing something complicated and slightly pained. The expression of a person doing something that doesn't come naturally because it needs to be done. Webb stopped at the edge of table 7. Emma looked up at him. She had apparently decided somewhere in the last 45 minutes that Marcus Webb was no longer a figure of threat or authority. She looked at him with the neutral assessment of a child who is waiting to see what an adult does next. Webb looked at Nathan. "Mr. Hayes," he said. "Webb," Nathan said, "I owe you an apology. You were doing your job." "I was doing my job badly." Webb said it with the directness of someone who had been in enough professional situations to know that partial accountability is worse than none. "I made an assumption. I acted on it in front of a room full of people, and the assumption was wrong. I'm sorry." Nathan looked at him for a moment. "I've been wrong about people too," he said. "I know it doesn't make it even," Nathan said. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying it happens to people who are otherwise decent." He paused. "And I figure you're otherwise decent." Webb was quiet. He stood with his hands at his sides, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Not a collapse, more like the release of tension that has been held past its usefulness. "How did you know?" he said. It came out quieter than he intended, the question underneath the question. "I didn't," Nathan said. "I was guessing based on limited data." Webb looked at him. The corner of his mouth moved. He stopped. "That's a very specific way to say that." "Old habit," Nathan said. Webb straightened up. He looked at Emma. "Your speech was better than his," he said, with the deliberate seriousness of someone making a real point in a light-sounding way. Emma looked surprised, then pleased, then thoughtful. "I didn't make a speech," she said. "I know," Webb said. "That's why it was better." He nodded once at Nathan. The particular nod of two people who have reached an understanding that doesn't require more words, and turned back toward the rear of the room. Nathan watched him go. Emma was watching Nathan. He apologized, she said. Yeah, that was hard for him. Nathan looked at her. How do you know? Emma considered this with the philosophical patience of someone who has given the matter genuine thought. Because he looked like how I look when I have to apologize to Jalen at school, she said. Like he really didn't want to, but he was going to anyway. Who's Jalen? This kid in my class. I borrowed his colored pencils without asking, and two of them broke, and I had to say sorry for 3 days before it felt like I meant it. Did you mean it? Eventually, Emma said. That's kind of how it works, right? You say it before you feel it, and then the feeling catches up. Nathan looked at his daughter across a table in the Meridian Grand Ballroom, surrounded by 400 people and white flowers, and the aftermath of something that was still settling, and he thought about the things she knew that he hadn't taught her. Yeah, he said. That's kind of how it works. Ava had returned to the stage. The program was continuing. She was introducing the Foundation's lead researcher, a compact, serious woman in her 40s who would speak for 12 minutes about the pediatric oncology work, and then there would be the formal donation segment, and the evening would move toward its close. Ava spoke the introduction smoothly, professionally, the practiced version of herself that ran these events. But her eyes moved to table 7 once during it, just once, briefly. Nathan caught it. He looked back at the stage and didn't react. The researcher came to the podium and began her presentation. Clear, dense with information, the kind of thing that required attention. Nathan paid attention. This was what Emma's $112 was going toward. This woman's work, these programs, these particular children in these particular hospitals. And he thought it mattered to know what you were giving to, even if the amount was small. Emma was listening too. She had her elbows on the table and her chin on her hands again, the position she used for movies and apparently also for pediatric oncology research presentations. And she was tracking the researcher's words with the focused seriousness of someone who has decided this is important. At one point, the researcher mentioned a 6-year-old girl who had enrolled in one of their trials and responded well to treatment and was currently, by all available measures, doing fine. Emma straightened slightly. Nathan felt it beside him. The small physical adjustment of a child who has located something personal inside information that seemed general. He didn't say anything about it. After the researcher finished, there was another round of applause, and then the light shifted again and the room relaxed into the donation segment, a more fluid part of the evening where guests could approach tables staffed by Foundation representatives and auction items were displayed along the east wall, and the noise level rose back toward the social. Ava reappeared at their table. She sat down across from them, and for a moment she said nothing. She just sat there, which Nathan was learning was something she did occasionally, allowed herself a moment of just being still without performing anything. How are you doing? She said finally. Nathan thought about it. Better than 45 minutes ago. That's a low bar. It's an honest bar. She looked at Emma. And you? Emma said, You said my envelope was the most important thing in the building. I meant it, Ava said, in front of everyone. That's usually how these things work, yes. Emma picked up her water glass and put it down again. She was processing something. Nathan let her process. I wasn't doing it to be important, Emma said. I was just doing it because it seemed right. Ava looked at her for a long moment. I know, she said. That's exactly why I said it. Emma thought about this. The logic of it worked on her slowly, and Nathan watched it land. The understanding that sometimes the things you do without calculating their effect are the things that have the most of it. It was too large a concept for a 9-year-old to hold completely, but she was holding the shape of it, which was enough for now. The Foundation representative came by the table with a quiet clipboard, and Ava had a brief exchange with her. Numbers, logistics, a specific donor who needed a follow-up call before the end of the week. It was the texture of how Ava's evening actually ran, the professional constant underneath the human moments. And Nathan watched it with the recognition of someone who also spent his days managing the gap between what things looked like and what they actually required. After the representative moved on, Ava looked at Nathan and said, I need to talk to you about something before the evening ends. Her voice had a different quality to it. Not heavier, but more careful. The quality of someone choosing an entry point to a conversation they've been thinking about for longer than the conversation they're about to have. All right, he said, not right now. When the program wraps. Is that okay? We're not going anywhere, he said, and it was almost the same thing he'd said to her 2 hours ago, but with different weight now. The first time it had been slightly sardonic, and this time it wasn't. She heard the difference. She nodded and stood back up and moved toward the east wall where a cluster of guests had gathered around her with the particular gravitational pull of people who have been waiting for access. Nathan turned back to table 7 and his daughter and the white flowers in the changed room around them, and he thought about what she wanted to talk about, and he thought about what it might mean, and then he did what he usually did with questions that didn't have answers yet. He set it down and waited. Emma was watching the auction items along the east wall with a specific speculative expression. Don't, Nathan said. I'm just looking. You're calculating. Emma folded her hands on the table with extreme innocence. I don't have any money, she said. I gave it all away. I know, Nathan said. I'm very proud of you. She smiled at her water glass, small and private, the way she did when something hit the exact right place. The evening continued. The Meridian Grand hummed around them with the specific noise of money and intention, and underneath both of those things, the particular frequency of a room full of people who had been changed by something small and were still deciding what to do about it. Nathan Hayes sat in his faded jacket and was, for the first time since they'd walked through the brass doors, entirely present in the room. Not comfortable. Present was different from comfortable, but present was enough. The auction segment wound down the way these things always did. Not with a clean ending, but with a gradual thinning, guests drifting away from the east wall, the energy of the room redistributing itself into smaller conversations, the particular looseness that settles over a crowd when the formal structure of an evening has concluded, and what remains is the human part. Emma had fallen into a quiet, comfortable state that Nathan recognized as the late stage of a long evening for a 9-year-old. Not tired enough to say she was tired, which she would resist until she was physically falling over, but moving more slowly, her responses coming with a slight delay, her eyes making longer stops. She was leaning against his arm with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has decided her father is the most comfortable piece of furniture in the room. He let her lean. He was watching the room in the way he'd been watching it all evening, not suspiciously, just attentively, the same reflex that had never fully quieted in him since the teams. The crowd had a different texture now than it had 3 hours ago, less performance in it. Some of that was the hour and the wine, but not all of it. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere the way pressure shifts before weather, and Nathan was aware of it without being able to name it precisely. People had been stopping by the table in ones and twos since he'd come down from the stage. Not in the aggressive networking way of people who see an opportunity and move toward it, but more tentatively. A man in his 60s who had served in Vietnam and wanted to shake Nathan's hand without making a speech about it. A woman who ran a children's literacy nonprofit and pressed her card on him with a slightly apologetic expression, as if she knew it wasn't the moment but couldn't entirely help herself. A couple who had said simply, and with the directness of people who meant exactly what they said and nothing more, that his speech had been the best thing they'd heard at one of these events in 20 years, and then moved on without waiting for a response. Nathan had handled all of it with the same steady quality he brought to everything. Grateful without being effusive, present without being warm in a way he didn't feel. Emma had fallen asleep briefly against his arm at one point, woken up when someone laughed too loudly at a nearby table, and denied with complete conviction that she had been asleep at all. This late drift of the evening that Ava finally came back. She sat down across from them, and this time there was something different in the way she sat. A slight forward quality, a purposefulness, the body language of someone who has been waiting to get to a specific moment and has now arrived at it. She had a glass of water. She set it on the table and looked at Nathan directly. I wanted to talk to you about Emma's education, she said. Nathan was quiet for a beat. Beside him, Emma had lifted her head from his arm and was now very awake, with the particular alertness of a child who has heard her name attached to a serious subject. Okay, Nathan said. I want to pay for it. All of it. Whatever she needs. School, college, whatever comes after college if she wants that. I want to take that off your plate entirely. She said it without preamble or cushioning, in the way she'd said most of the important things tonight, directly, as a fact that was already decided on her end, presented for his consideration rather than his approval. Nathan looked at her. He didn't say anything right away. Emma looked at Nathan, then at Ava, then back at Nathan, tracking the exchange with the careful attention of someone who understands that what happens in the next 60 seconds matters. "That's a large thing to offer," Nathan said. "It's a proportionate thing," Ava said. "You gave me my life. I've been living it for 3 years. I want to give something back that means something." "You don't owe me anything." "I know I don't owe you. That's not what this is." She kept her voice level, but there was something underneath it, a firmness, not aggressive but absolute, the quality of someone who has already done the moral math on this and arrived at an answer they're not going to be argued out of. When someone does something for you that you can't repay directly, you find a different direction to send the gratitude. That's not debt. That's just how generosity works. "I don't need Nathan." She said his name once, clearly, not to interrupt him, but to make sure he was hearing the next part carefully. "This isn't for you. I'm not offering to help you. I'm offering to make sure Emma has every option available to her. That's different." He looked at Emma. Emma was sitting very straight in her chair. She was looking at Ava with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "Emma," Nathan said, "you don't have to look like that." "Like what?" Emma said with tremendous dignity. "Like someone just told you there's a puppy in the other room." Emma's tremendous dignity wobbled slightly. "I'm just listening," she said. Nathan looked back at Ava. He picked up his water glass. He set it down. He pressed his thumb along the edge of the table, a small, private gesture of thinking, the kind you make when the thought is too large to just sit with silently and your hands need something to do. "I've been taking care of her," he said, "on my own, for 3 years. I haven't—" He stopped. He tried again. "I haven't asked anyone for anything in that time. That's not pride, exactly. It's more that asking felt like," he looked for the word, "like admitting the weight of it. And if I admitted the weight of it, I wasn't sure I could keep carrying it." Ava listened without filling the space. She had the rare quality of being able to sit with what someone was saying without reaching for the next thing to say over the top of it. "So I carried it quietly," he said, "and we did fine. Emma's in a good school. She's healthy. She has what she needs." "I know," Ava said. "I'm not suggesting she doesn't. I'm suggesting she could have more options, and that there's no reason she shouldn't." She paused. "What would Sarah have wanted for her?" It was a precise question. Nathan felt it land with the accuracy of something thrown by someone who understood exactly what they were throwing. He was quiet for a long moment. Emma had gone very still beside him. She knew her mother's name. She knew what the weight of it did to a room when it arrived. "Everything," Nathan said finally. He would have wanted everything for her. "Then let me help give her that." Nathan looked at his daughter. Emma was looking back at him with those brown eyes that had been noticing things since she was old enough to notice anything. He thought about the ceramic duck bank. He thought about 4 months of saved lunch money. He thought about a little girl who stood up in front of a man twice her size, not because she wasn't scared, but because there was something she needed to do regardless. He thought about Sarah, who had spent the last 4 months of her life making him promise to let people in, who had said, in the hospital, with the IV in her arm, and the particular clarity that comes when there isn't time left for anything except what's true. "You're going to need help, Nathan. Take it. That's not weakness. That's math." He had not been good at keeping that promise. "It would be for Emma," he said. Not a question. Clarifying. "It would be for Emma," Ava confirmed. "In her name. Whatever form works best for you both. A trust, a direct account, whatever your attorney recommends. You'd have full oversight." "I don't have an attorney." "I can recommend one." "I figured." A small silence. Not uncomfortable. More like the silence at the end of something, when the thing has been decided and what remains is the acknowledgement of it. "Okay," Nathan said. Ava looked at him. "Okay?" "Yeah." He exhaled once, a controlled exhale, the kind that carries something out with it. "Okay." Emma made a sound. It was small and it was quick, and she immediately pressed her lips together to contain it, but it had gotten out, and Nathan looked at her, and she was looking at the table with the elaborate casualness of someone pretending they hadn't just made a sound. "Emma?" he said. "I didn't say anything." You made a sound. I was clearing my throat. You were celebrating quietly. Emma kept her eyes on the table. Her lips were pressed very firmly together. Her shoulders had the rigid quality of someone maintaining composure through significant effort. Emma. She looked up. Her eyes were bright. Can I say one thing? One thing. Thank you, she said to Ava. She said it the way she said things she meant completely, simply, without decoration, looking directly at the person she was saying it to. Not just for the school stuff, for what you said about my envelope. It was, she thought about it. I worked really hard on that money, and nobody knew except Dad. And you told everyone. Ava looked at Emma for a moment with an expression that was doing several quiet things at once. You earned that, she said. I just said it out loud. Emma nodded and looked back at the table. The brightness in her eyes had gotten more pronounced, and she was clearly managing it with the same fierce private dignity she brought to most things. Nathan put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and nobody said anything for a moment, which was the right amount of time. It was into this particular quiet that a man appeared at the edge of their table. Nathan noticed him a second before he spoke, had actually clocked him moving through the room toward them for about 20 seconds, with the specific quality of approach that meant intention. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the compactly powerful build of someone who had once been athletic and was now simply dense with years and decisions. He wore his tuxedo the way men wear clothes they've worn so long they've stopped thinking about them. He held a glass of scotch he was not drinking. His name, Nathan would learn in approximately 30 seconds, was Richard Calloway. As in Calloway Tower, as in the building that had been on fire 3 years ago. Ms. Kensington, he said, with the particular nod of two people who know each other in professional contexts and have a mutual respect that doesn't require warmth. I apologize for interrupting. Richard, Ava said. There was something careful in her voice. Not unfriendly, but calibrated. Calloway looked at Nathan. He had the eyes of someone who spent a lot of time evaluating things quickly and was very good at it and knew he was very good at it, which was not always a flattering combination, but in this case seemed held in check by something else. Something that looked, Nathan thought, like the particular humility of a man who has been in the same room as his own inadequacy for long enough to recognize it. Mr. Hayes, he said. Nathan looked at him. Yeah. Richard Calloway. He extended his hand. The Calloway Tower was my building. Nathan shook his hand. A beat. Okay, he said. Calloway seemed to be measuring something in that response. He found a chair at the adjacent table, glanced at Ava briefly. She gave him nothing, just watched, and sat down without being invited in the way of people who are old enough and powerful enough to have stopped waiting for invitations and haven't yet decided whether that's a good quality or not. I've known about the fire for 3 years, Calloway said. I've known about what you did. I commissioned an investigation afterward, full report on what happened, who responded, casualties, the whole picture. He paused. Your name wasn't in it, not officially, but one of the first responders gave a statement about a civilian who'd carried someone out and gone back in, and I spent some time trying to find out who that was. Nathan looked at him. You're the second person who told me that tonight. Ava has better resources than I do, Calloway said, with a dry quality that suggested this was a fact he'd made his peace with. But I kept looking through different channels. I found a construction permit pulled last year for a project in Queens. Project manager's name on the paperwork matched a description I'd been given. I wasn't certain enough to reach out. He looked at Nathan steadily. Then tonight happened. Tonight happened, Nathan agreed. Calloway turned the glass of scotch in his hand. I want to offer you something, he said. And I want to be clear that it's not gratitude, or not only gratitude, because I've learned that when powerful people offer things out of gratitude alone, it usually benefits them more than the recipient. So let me tell you what it is practically, and you can evaluate it on those terms. Nathan watched him. He respected the disclaimer. It was more honest than most. I have a development project, Calloway said. Major residential and commercial complex. Lower Manhattan, 18 months into planning, 18 months from ground break. My current project director had a health issue 2 months ago. He's going to be fine, but he can't manage the scope of this project while he's recovering, and I've been looking for someone to step in. He paused. Not a figurehead, not a courtesy position. I need someone who can actually run the operation, who understands construction, manages people, makes decisions under pressure. and has the judgment to know which problems to solve and which problems to ignore. Nathan was quiet for a moment. What's the scope? Calloway told him. Square footage, unit count, the commercial component, the timeline, the budget bracket. He said the numbers with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has said large numbers often enough that they don't perform them. Nathan listened. He did the math that he always did when someone told him a project's numbers. The real math, the kind that lived under the official numbers, the gap between what projects said they were and what they actually required. He had been doing this for 5 years. He knew the difference between a project with good bones and a project that was going to eat someone alive. Who's your structural engineer? He asked. Calloway blinked. Briefly, a small adjustment. He hadn't expected that to be the first question. Patricia Wren, Wren & Associates. I know her work. It's solid. Nathan paused. Who's your GC? We haven't finalized. That would partly depend on who's running it. What's your contingency built at? 12%. Nathan made a small sound. Not dismissive, evaluative. 12's low for that scope, he said. I know it's low. You'd want to be at 15 minimum, 18 if your timeline is fixed. The timeline has some flexibility. Then you want 15. Calloway looked at him. He had the expression of a man who is accustomed to people trying to impress him in the first 5 minutes of a conversation about professional competence, and who has learned over decades to distinguish between performance and the real thing, and who was currently listening to the real thing and knew it. Would you be willing to have a more detailed conversation? Calloway said. This week, my office. Bring whatever questions you have. No commitments from either side. Just a conversation. Nathan looked at Ava. She was watching him with the neutral expression of someone who has specifically decided not to influence a decision that isn't hers to make. He respected that too. He looked at Emma. She had been following this exchange with the comprehensive attention she brought to everything, and she was currently watching him with an expression he recognized as her waiting face, the one she used when she was letting him think without interrupting, which she had learned was more effective than the alternative. What's the compensation range? He asked Calloway. Calloway told him. Nathan was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I'd need to see the site plans and the current project documentation before the meeting, he said. Whatever you have on the structural assessment, the soil reports, the permit status. I don't walk into conversations without knowing what I'm looking at. I can have all of that to you by Tuesday. Then I can do Thursday. Calloway extended his hand again. Nathan shook it again, and this time there was a different quality to it. Not the cautious solemnity of two people sizing each other up, but something more transactional, which was in its way more genuine. Calloway stood. He looked at Emma. Young lady, he said, I heard what you said to Marcus Webb tonight, about your envelope. Emma looked at him carefully. How did you hear that? I was standing about 10 feet away when it happened. Emma considered this. Were you going to say anything? Calloway's expression did something that might have been embarrassment if it had been allowed to develop fully. I was still making up my mind, he said, which was the honest version of what most people in that room had been doing at that moment, and he seemed to know it was honest and to have decided that honesty was what the situation required. Emma nodded with the seriousness of a judge weighing a testimony. That's okay, she said. Making up your mind takes time sometimes. It does, Calloway said. Good night, Emma. Good night, Mr. Calloway. He moved away through the thinning crowd. Nathan watched him go. Dad, Emma said. Is that a good thing? What he offered. It might be. How much of a good thing? I'm still making up my mind, he said. Emma accepted this with the equanimity of someone who has just established that making up your mind takes time sometimes, and therefore cannot in good conscience push for faster results. Ava was looking at Nathan with something that was close to amusement but had a more complicated undertone. You just negotiated your first substantial career move of the evening while your daughter was listing her educational options in her head, she said. I wasn't listing anything, Emma said. You were absolutely listing, Nathan said. Emma folded her hands on the table. I was simply thinking about possibilities, she said, with tremendous dignity. Ava pressed her hand flat on the table briefly, which was what she did, Nathan had noticed, when something was making her want to laugh at a moment that didn't strictly call for it. The room had thinned considerably. The chandeliers burned the same as they had 3 hours ago, but the space beneath them was different, quieter, the staff beginning the invisible processes of an event winding down, guests collecting coats and cards, and making the social noises of departure. The energy had changed from the purposeful hum of people with agendas to the softer variable energy of people who had gotten what they came for and were ready to go. Ava looked at Nathan. There was something in her face that he'd been aware of all evening, something she hadn't said yet, that was separate from the practical conversations about Emma and Calloway's project and the mechanics of the night. Something more personal, sitting underneath everything else, occasionally visible the way objects are visible through water. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've asked me a lot of things tonight. One more." "All right. Are you okay?" She said it simply. "Not tonight specifically, just in general. Are you okay?" He looked at her. The question caught him slightly off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was precise. People asked how he was doing constantly. They asked in the social way that requires the answer fine, and he gave the answer fine, and everyone moved on. Ava was asking something different, and the difference was in the particular quality of attention she was paying to his face while she waited for the answer. "Some days better than others," he said. "That's honest." "You asked an honest question." She nodded. "Is Emma the thing that makes the better days better?" He looked at his daughter, who had rested her head on his arm again and was watching the remaining guests with the drowsy, comprehensive attention of someone operating on the edge of sleep. "She's the thing that makes the worst days possible," he said. Ava was quiet. She looked at Emma, too. Emma, feeling the weight of two adults looking at her, opened one eye. "I'm still awake," Emma said. "I know," Nathan said. "I'm just resting." "Okay." Emma closed her eye again. Ava turned back to Nathan. "I want to say something, and I want to be clear that it's not a transaction or an obligation. I'm saying it because I want to say it." "Okay." "I'm glad you came tonight. I know you almost didn't. I know tonight was hard in ways that had nothing to do with Marcus and the entry situation. And I'm glad you came anyway, and I'm glad Emma dragged you here." "She didn't drag me," Nathan said. "I know, but she made you decide." He didn't argue with that, because it was accurate. "I'm glad too," he said. He said it looking at the table rather than at her, which was as much as he had for that particular sentence at that particular moment, and she seemed to understand that. The formal evening was nearly over, and what it was leaving behind was a different arrangement of things than what it had started with. A man in a faded jacket who had come to a room where he didn't belong and had changed the temperature of it without trying to. A woman who had spent 3 years carrying a debt she couldn't pay and had found, in the course of one evening, both the person she owed and a direction for the payment. A little girl whose $112 had sat on a table all night in a white envelope and had turned out, in the end, to be the thing the room remembered most about itself. And Marcus Webb, who appeared at the table one final time near the end of the evening, not for a conversation, but simply to confirm that arrangements had been made for a foundation car to take Nathan and Emma home. He had organized it himself quietly, without being asked, and he said so without ceremony, in the way of a man trying to correct an equation by adding to one side rather than subtracting from the other. Nathan started to say that they didn't need it. "Dad?" Emma said, without opening her eyes. He stopped. "Okay," he said to Webb. "Thank you." Webb nodded. He started to move away, then stopped. He looked at Nathan with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something for 2 hours and has decided to just say it. "Your speech," he said. "The part about what people do when no one's watching. I've been doing this job for 11 years, and He stopped. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "I'm going to try to do it differently." Nathan looked at him. He thought about several responses and chose the simplest one. "That's the whole thing," he said. "That's all there is." Webb held his gaze for a moment and then moved on, back to his post, back to the diminishing work of an evening that was closing. And Nathan Hayes watched him and thought that sometimes the things you say when you don't know anyone is listening find their way to the people who needed them most. Across the room, visible through the thinning crowd, the registration table where it had all started 3 hours ago was being quietly broken down by 2 staff members stacking materials into a cart. The woman who had scanned the list and not found Nathan's name had long since been replaced. The space where he and Emma had been asked to wait, The 3 feet of floor where Emma had held her envelope and stood her ground was just floor again now. But Nathan knew it was there, and he figured, in some way he couldn't articulate, that it would always be there. That rooms hold things in them long after the people leave. He looked at Emma. She was genuinely asleep now, her head against his arm, her breathing slow and even, the blue Easter dress slightly creased at the hem, her hair with its one different section catching the chandelier light. The white envelope was still on the table in front of her. He picked it up carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He would make sure it got where it was going, the car. Richard Calloway's foundation had arranged was a black sedan, clean and warm, and it was waiting at the side entrance of the Meridian Grand when Nathan carried Emma out through the brass doors at 11:47 on a Saturday night in November. She had woken up briefly when he lifted her from the chair, opened her eyes, looked at him, said, "I can walk," and then immediately rested her head on his shoulder in a way that made clear she had no intention of walking. He carried her anyway. She was still small enough to carry, and he was aware, in the particular way of parents, that this would not be true indefinitely, and he didn't waste the opportunities when they presented themselves. Ava walked them out. She had her coat on now, the formal evening version of herself folded away, and she looked, in the side entrance light, more like a person and less like a CEO, which Nathan suspected was closer to what she actually was. The driver held the door. Nathan got Emma settled in the back seat, her head against the window, the blue dress bundled carefully. He straightened up and turned to Ava. "Thank you," he said, "for stopping Marcus." "Thank you for not leaving when he told you to," she said. He almost smiled. Emma made that decision. Emma makes a lot of decisions. She does, he agreed. Ava looked at him in the particular way she'd been looking at him all evening, direct, without performance, the look of someone who had decided that honesty was the most efficient use of limited time. "Thursday," she said. "Calloway's meeting. Will you actually go?" "I said I would." "I know you said you would. I'm asking if you will." He understood the distinction. She was asking about the version of Nathan Hayes that said things, and the version that did them, and whether those were reliably the same person. "They're the same," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean." She nodded. She believed him, he could tell, not because he'd convinced her in this moment, but because the whole of the evening had been one long piece of evidence for exactly that. "I'll call you Tuesday," she said. "About Emma's education, the logistics, the structure. I'll have my attorney draft some options and we can go through them together." "All right." She put her hand out. He shook it. It was the formal gesture of two people who have had an entirely informal evening and are acknowledging that there is a professional dimension to what comes next and that they can hold both things at once. "Get home safe," she said. "You too." He got in the car, the door closed. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the side entrance, and Ava Kensington was standing on the sidewalk in the November cold in her coat, and she lifted one hand briefly. Not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, and then turned and went back inside. Nathan looked at his daughter. She was asleep against the window, her breath making a small fog on the glass. He leaned back in the seat. Through the windshield, Manhattan moved past in its nighttime version. Lit windows, empty sidewalks, the particular quiet of a city that never fully sleeps, but does sometimes exhale. He thought about the evening. All of it, in order, the way he processed things, systematically, without rushing to conclusions. The invitation on the kitchen counter, the ceramic duck bank, the look on Emma's face when she'd read the words children's medical research. Marcus Webb's hand on his arm, the two words that had filled the ballroom. Emma walking forward with her envelope. Ava's face when she'd recognized him across a crowded room. His own voice coming back to him through the microphone, saying things he'd never said out loud to anyone. Things about Sarah, about the year he'd held himself together through nothing but necessity, about the particular loneliness of grief that functions because it has no choice. He hadn't planned to say any of it. He'd walked up to that stage intending to say something brief and polite and inoffensive, and what had come out instead was the truth, which was messier and more specific and apparently what the room had needed, though he still wasn't entirely sure why. He thought about Richard Calloway's offer. The scope of that project was real. He'd done the math in his head during the conversation, and the numbers worked. And more than the numbers, the challenge of it worked. It was the kind of project that required the kind of management that Nathan was actually good at. Not the performative kind, not the political kind, but the ground-level practical kind that required you to understand the difference between a problem and a crisis and respond to each one correctly. He hadn't let himself want something professionally in a while. Wanting things required energy he'd been directing elsewhere, and it required a certain openness to the future that grief makes complicated. He noticed, sitting in the back of that car in the dark, that he wanted this. He noted the wanting without making too much of it. One step at a time. Thursday 1st. Emma shifted in her sleep. She made a small sound and then was still again, her hand opening and closing once against the seat. Nathan watched her. This was the thing he came back to, always, the fixed point. Whatever else the evening had been, whatever it meant for his career, for his understanding of himself, for the specific gravity of Ava Kensington's presence, and what it might eventually mean that she had found him after 3 years of looking. Underneath all of it was this: Emma, asleep, the blue dress, the one section of hair that was different from the rest. He had made a lot of decisions in his life, many of them under conditions that didn't allow for reflection. Some of them he was at peace with, and some of them he carried in ways he'd learned to manage. But the decision to come home from the teams when Sarah got sick, to choose the certain over the essential, his family over the work that had defined him for 8 years, that decision had never cost him anything, in the final accounting, that he wasn't glad to have paid. Emma was the math that made everything else add up. The car crossed into their neighborhood, and the city changed around them. Less glass and light, more brick, and the particular residential density of a part of Manhattan that still had hardware stores and bodegas and people who'd lived on the same block for 20 years. Nathan knew every intersection. He'd walked Emma to school from here for 3 years, in all weather, sometimes running late, sometimes with the calm of a morning that had gone right, occasionally with the specific disaster of a morning where everything that could go wrong had gone wrong in sequence, and they'd arrived at school 7 minutes late with mismatched socks and granola bars in their pockets because there hadn't been time for anything else. He had been happy on some of those mornings. The mismatched sock ones, sometimes most of all. The car stopped in front of their building. The driver said goodnight. Nathan got Emma out. She half woke again, muttered something that included the word movie, and then went back under, and carried her up the 2 flights of stairs that their building's elevator had not reliably served since approximately the previous administration. He got her inside, got her shoes off, got her onto her bed without fully waking her, which was a technical achievement that required the particular practiced stealth of a parent who has done this hundreds of times. He pulled the blanket up. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. The ceramic duck bank was back on the windowsill. He'd put it there 2 weeks ago when he'd finally taken it down from the closet, quietly, while Emma was at school. He'd put $40 in it, not to replace what she'd saved, because that wasn't the point, but because an empty bank on a windowsill seemed like the wrong lesson for a 9-year-old to look at every morning. He looked at it now in the ambient light from the window. It was a ridiculous object. Yellow, slightly lopsided, the painted smile a little uneven because Sarah had been laughing when she'd done that part. Emma had not found this lopsidedness charming when she was 4. She found it charming now, which Nathan thought was one of the things that happens when you grow up. The imperfections start to look like the point. He stood up. He went to the kitchen. He put the kettle on, not because he wanted tea particularly, but because he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't thinking. He took Emma's white envelope from his jacket pocket and set it on the kitchen counter. $112. He'd confirmed with Ava before they left that the Foundation's online donation system was available around the clock, and that Emma's donation could be submitted with a note attributing it to her by name, and that it would go directly to the Pediatric Oncology Research Fund. He got his phone out. The Foundation's website was clean and navigable. He found the donation page. He entered the amount. In the name field, he typed, Emma Hayes, age 9. She saved this herself. He paused over the message field for a moment, then typed, for the kids who need it most, which was what Emma had written on the piece of notebook paper inside the envelope, and it was accurate, and he didn't see a reason to improve on it. He submitted it. The confirmation email arrived 40 seconds later. He read it once and set his phone on the counter and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the counter surface, just standing. The kettle started to whistle. He made tea he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table in his faded navy jacket and thought about what Sarah would have said about tonight. He knew what she would have said. She would have said, in her dry, precise way, "So it took a building fire, 3 years, and one very determined 9-year-old to get you to ask for help." And then she would have said, "That's efficient, Nathan. Very on brand." He sat with that for a while. Outside, Manhattan continued its nighttime version of itself. November wind moved through the gap between buildings in the way it does in this city, purposeful, with somewhere to be. The kitchen clock moved its minute hand from 12:47 to 12:48. Nathan Hayes sat at his kitchen table and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately date, that the ground under him was solid, not fixed. Solid wasn't the same as fixed. Solid meant it would hold his weight while he moved. He went to bed. The following Tuesday, Ava called at 9 in the morning, which he appreciated. Not first thing, but not so late in the business day that it felt like an afterthought. She had her attorney on a separate line. They went through the structure of Emma's education fund for 40 minutes, and Nathan asked specific questions, and the attorney answered them without condescension. And by the end of it, a framework had been agreed on that Nathan's own attorney, he had gone, on Monday, to find one. A straightforward man in his 50s who specialized in family and estate matters and charged reasonable rates and had no interest in making simple things complicated, could review by the end of the week. Before she hung up, Ava said, "How's Emma?" "She's been telling everyone at school about the gala," Nathan said. "Everything?" Selective highlights. Marcus Webb has apparently become a more interesting character in the retelling. Ava laughed. The real kind, the one that surprised her slightly. What version of Marcus is she telling? The version where he's larger, louder, and ultimately redeemed. It's a better story. "Kids are better editors than adults," Ava said. "Yeah," Nathan agreed. "They cut straight to what matters." A brief pause. The professional kind that precedes a return to professional matters. "Thursday," Ava said. "Calloway's office. Do you need the address?" "I have it. Call me after if you want." "I will," he said, and meant it. Thursday arrived with the kind of gray November morning that New York does well. Not hostile, just serious. Nathan wore his best work clothes. Not a tuxedo and not the faded navy jacket either, but the version of himself that existed between those two things. Dark trousers, a charcoal shirt, the kind of jacket that said he understood the occasion without pretending to be someone he wasn't. Emma watched him get dressed from the doorway of his bedroom. She had her backpack on, school morning, and her assessment of his appearance was delivered with the critical authority she brought to these matters. "You look good," she said. "Yeah? You look like you, but like the version of you that's trying a little." He looked at her in the mirror. "Is that good or bad?" She thought about it. "Good. People should try a little. It shows respect." He turned around. "Where did you get that?" "Miss Petrova says it. About homework." Emma adjusted one strap of her backpack. "It applies to other things, too." He walked her to school. They stopped at the corner bodega, the way they did on days when the morning had gone well enough to allow for a slight detour, and Emma got a hot chocolate and Nathan got his coffee, and they walked the last 2 blocks with the easy quiet of people who are comfortable not talking. At the school gate, Emma stopped. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "The meeting today, the project thing." "What about it?" She looked at him with Sarah's eyes. "Do you want it? The job?" He looked at her. "I think so." "Then go get it," she said. It was simple and direct and entirely free of hedging, the way 9-year-olds say things when they haven't yet learned to qualify their confidence. "You're good at building things." He stood on the sidewalk outside his daughter's school on a gray November Thursday and felt something move in his chest that had no clean name. "I'll pick you up at 3, he said. "I know." She turned toward the gate, then looked back once. "Also, if they offer you coffee, take it, it's polite." "I know how meetings work, Emma." "Just checking," she said, and went through the gate. He watched her go. The backpack, the hair with its one different section, the particular walk that was all Emma and had been all Emma since she was old enough to walk. And then he turned toward the subway and the rest of the day. Richard Calloway's office was on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown, with a view of the city that Nathan spent approximately 4 seconds appreciating before turning his attention to the project documentation that had been waiting on the conference table. He'd arrived 8 minutes early. He'd reviewed the soil reports and structural assessment on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings after Emma was in bed, making notes on a legal pad in the shorthand he'd developed over 5 years of project management. Calloway arrived with two other people, a woman who handled the legal and contractual side, and a younger man who had been assisting the outgoing project director and knew the current status of the planning documents in the granular way that only someone who has been living inside a project for 18 months can know it. They sat down. Nathan put his legal pad on the table. "Before we start," Calloway said, "I want to say something that isn't about the project." Nathan waited. "Saturday night," Calloway said. "What you said on that stage. I've been in business for 40 years. I've sat through more keynote speeches and inspirational talks than I can count, at events exactly like that one." He paused. "I don't remember most of them. I'm going to remember yours." Nathan looked at him. "I wasn't trying to be memorable." "I know," Calloway said. "That's why it was." A brief silence, and then, with the mutual efficiency of two people who have said what needed saying and are ready to work. "Let's talk about the project." They talked for 3 hours. Nathan asked the questions he'd prepared and several he hadn't, the ones that came from actually reading the documents carefully and finding the places where the numbers didn't quite align with the stated timeline. He pushed back on two structural assumptions with specific reasoning. He agreed with the general approach to the commercial component, but proposed a sequencing change that the younger man, his name was Derek, and he was sharper than his age suggested, with the specific sharp quality of someone who had learned more than his title implied, had actually flagged internally 6 months ago and been overridden on. "He was right," Nathan said, without looking up from the plans. Derek looked at his boss. Calloway looked at Nathan. "Yes," he said. "He was." There was a particular moment in that room, around the 2-hour mark, when the conversation had moved from Nathan asking questions to Nathan and Derek standing at the table with the site plans open between them, talking through a logistics sequence with the fluent shorthand of people who think in the same spatial language. When Calloway sat back in his chair and watched this and made a decision. He didn't say it yet. But Nathan, who had spent 8 years reading rooms, felt the decision being made. At the end of the 3 hours, they shook hands. Not the exploratory handshake of Saturday night, but the different kind, the kind that is already pointing toward the next conversation. "I'll have my attorney in touch with yours this week," Calloway said. "All right," Nathan said. "One thing," Calloway said, "and you can take this however you like. I've hired a lot of people in 40 years. I've hired people with better credentials than you. Better pedigrees, longer resumes, more recognizable names." He paused. "The best ones always had what you have, which is the ability to look at something complicated and tell the difference between what's actually a problem and what just looks like one. That's not a school thing. I don't know where it comes from." Nathan thought about 8 years of decisions made in dark places with incomplete information and the knowledge that the cost of getting it wrong was someone's life. He thought about the particular math of those moments, the way they had trained him, against his nature, to stay calm, when calm was the most important tool available. "It comes from practice," he said. Calloway nodded. He seemed to understand that the practice Nathan was referring to was not the kind that happened in offices. Nathan left the building at 12:40 and stood on the Midtown sidewalk in the November gray and called Ava. She picked up on the second ring. "How'd it go?" she said. "Good, I think." "Good, I think, or good?" "Good," he said. "It went good." A brief pause on her end. He heard the particular quiet of someone who is pleased about something and is deciding how much to show it. "I'm glad," she said. "It's a good project, complicated in the right ways." That's a very you description. He stood on the sidewalk with people moving around him in the lunchtime stream. "I wanted to say something," he said. "Okay." "Saturday. What you did. Stopping Marcus, telling the room. You didn't have to do that in front of everyone. You could have handled it quietly." "I could have," Ava agreed. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, the brief pause of someone who is being honest rather than quick. "Because the room needed to see it," she said. "Not for you. You didn't need them to see it, and I knew that. But there were 400 people in that room who had looked at you and decided something wrong, and the only way to correct that was to correct it where they could all see." She paused. "I was also, honestly, angry. I don't always have the most strategic response when I'm angry. You seem strategic. I was angry strategically, she said. There's a difference. He almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that she probably heard it. Thank you, he said, for all of it. Nathan, she said, and there was something in the way she said his name that was different from the professional mode, quieter, more direct. You went back into a burning building for people you didn't know. I stopped a security guard and told the truth about it at a party. The scale of those two things is not comparable. He didn't argue with her. He'd learned over the course of the evening that Ava Kensington had a clear and uncomplicated relationship with accuracy, and that arguing with accurate things was not a good use of either of their time. I'll be in touch, he said. I know, she said, and hung up. He put his phone in his pocket and walked to the subway. He had 2 hours and 20 minutes before he needed to pick up Emma, which was enough time to stop at the apartment, change out of the meeting clothes, and pick up the supplies for tonight. Friday was their movie night. He did not cancel Friday movie night for anything. He had not canceled it in 3 years. Not for work, not for exhaustion, not for the several occasions when he had been so tired by the end of a week that the couch had a gravitational pull that felt genuinely physical. Emma looked forward to it with the steady, anticipatory certainty of someone who trusts that certain things will simply be there. And Nathan had made his peace long ago with the fact that being the kind of parent whose kid trusts that certain things will simply be there required him to make sure they were. He stopped at the grocery store. Microwave popcorn, the good kind that Emma insisted on, and was probably indistinguishable from the other kind, but he'd stopped arguing about it 2 years ago. The specific orange soda she liked that he didn't like and kept buying anyway. The chocolate pretzels that were technically dessert, and that they ate halfway through every movie and finished afterward. He picked her up at 3. She came through the school gate and found him on the sidewalk and said, without preamble, "How was it?" "Good," he said. "I think it's going to work out." Emma looked at him with the evaluative precision she inherited from both sides. "You took the coffee," she said. "I took the coffee." She nodded with satisfaction. They walked home. That evening, with the popcorn made and the orange soda open, and Emma in her pajamas on the couch with a blanket that was technically decorative and had been fully repurposed as a nap blanket since approximately the second week they'd owned it, they watched a movie about a dog who got lost and found his way home, which Emma had already seen twice and insisted on anyway. About 40 minutes in, Emma said, without looking away from the screen, "Dad? Are we going to be okay?" He looked at her. She was still watching the movie, the blanket pulled up to her chin, a handful of popcorn suspended on its way to her mouth. "Yeah," he said. "We're going to be okay." She ate the popcorn. "Better than before?" He thought about the evening at the Meridian Grand, all of it, the whole sequence, from the invitation on the kitchen counter to the car ride home to the confirmation email and the legal pad, and Calloway's handshake and Ava's voice on the phone saying the scale of those two things is not comparable. He thought about sitting at a kitchen table at 12:48 in the morning feeling, for the first time in years, that the ground was solid. "Yeah," he said, "better than before." Emma ate more popcorn. On the screen, the dog was running through a field toward a boy who was running toward the dog, and Emma had seen this 3 times and still leaned forward slightly when it happened, which Nathan thought was one of the truest things about her, that she knew how things ended and wanted to see them end that way again anyway. "Good," she said. They watched the rest of the movie. They finished the chocolate pretzels. Emma fell asleep approximately 8 minutes before the credits, which was her precise average, and Nathan sat in the quiet apartment with the blanket pulled up over her and the television turned down and the November city outside the window doing its nighttime things. He sat there for a while. He was not a man who reflected easily or often. Reflection required the kind of stillness that his life had rarely provided, and he'd learned to process things in motion rather than at rest. But tonight, in the particular quiet of a Friday that had ended better than it began, he allowed himself to sit still. "I thought about what it means to live with integrity when nobody's looking." He'd said something like that on a stage in front of 400 people, and he'd said it because it was the thing he actually believed, the organizing principle of a life that had not always been easy or clear or right, but had been, as consistently as he could make it, honest. You do the thing because it needs doing. You go back into the building because there might be someone in there. You carry your daughter's lunch money for 4 months in a ceramic duck because she is saving it for children she will never meet. You stand still when a man twice your size tells you to leave because leaving is not the right thing, and fear doesn't get to make that decision. These were not dramatic acts. They didn't look like much from the outside. A man standing still, a girl walking forward, a hand extended in a smoke-filled stairwell. The world is full of people doing small things with complete commitment, and most of those things go unseen, and the people who do them don't do them expecting to be seen. That's the whole point. The moment you do it for the audience is the moment you've changed what it is. But sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, someone sees anyway. And sometimes the thing that gets seen is exactly what was needed, by exactly the people who needed it, at exactly the moment when they were capable of being changed by it. Marcus Webb standing at the back of a ballroom, reassembling 11 years of professional certainty around a different foundation. 400 people sitting with the discomfort of having made a wrong decision in public and deciding one by one what to do with that. Richard Calloway at his conference table, watching two men talk about load-bearing logistics and making a decision he'd been moving toward for 3 years. A woman who had spent those same 3 years trying to locate a debt she couldn't pay, and had found instead that the payment had been compounding the whole time. And here, on a couch in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with an unreliable elevator, a 9-year-old girl asleep under a blanket, her popcorn bowl empty, her savings donated, her future being arranged by people who had been moved by her without her even trying. Nathan Hayes was not a man who expected life to be fair. He had seen too much to hold that particular expectation. But he had come to understand something more useful, that the things you do in good faith have a way of returning to you, not because the universe is inherently just, but because people are sometimes better than the worst thing they've ever done. And occasionally, on a Saturday night in November, a room full of people who had decided something wrong gets the chance to decide something right. He turned the television off. The apartment was quiet. Emma breathed steadily. The ceramic duck sat on the windowsill in Emma's room with $40 in it and a lopsided painted smile that Sarah had made while laughing. Nathan Hayes sat in the dark and did not feel alone. That was new. Or not new. Returned. The way things come back when you've finally stopped closing the door on them. He wasn't fixed. He knew that. He was the same person who had stood at a bathroom mirror 3 weeks ago holding a funeral tie and putting it back. The same person who had been in pieces for a year and called it functioning. The same person who still sometimes dreamed about smoke and couldn't always remember in the first seconds of waking whether it was the building or something else. He was not fixed. He was just standing on ground that would hold. That was enough. It was in fact everything. He put the blanket more securely around Emma's shoulders and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The gala raised $2.3 million that night, the highest single event total in the Kensington Foundation's history. A significant portion of it came from donors who, by their own later accounts, had been moved by things that had nothing to do with the scheduled program. Emma's donation of $112 was noted in the Foundation's annual report, not by amount but by attribution, in a line that read, "The evening's first donation was made by a 9-year-old girl who saved her lunch money for 4 months. Several major donors privately said that line was the reason they'd written the checks they'd written. Ava fulfilled every commitment she made that night. The Education Trust was finalized within 3 weeks, structured cleanly, with Nathan's attorney satisfied on every point. The Veteran Employment Initiative, which Ava had been developing in concept for 2 years and had been waiting for the right moment and the right story to launch publicly, was announced the following spring. She called it the Hayes Initiative, which Nathan found out about from a press release Emma found on the internet and printed out and taped to the refrigerator before he'd been told. "Emma," he said, looking at the printout. "It has your name," she said, with complete satisfaction. "I see that. Is it okay?" He looked at the printout. The Hayes Initiative, a nationwide program to place veterans in leadership positions across construction, engineering, and infrastructure sectors, funded, structured, named. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." The Callaway project came together in the way good projects come together. Not easily, not without problems, but with the particular productive friction of work that is being done by people who know what they're doing and are honest when they don't. Nathan was on the job by January with Derek as his primary operations lead, which turned out to be the right decision for reasons that became apparent within the first month. They had an argument in week 3 over a sequencing issue that was loud enough to concern the structural engineer in the adjacent office, and they resolved it correctly. And after that, the working relationship had the comfortable durability of two people who've learned each other's actual limits rather than their performed ones. Marcus Webb left the Meridian Grand in February. Not fired. He resigned, in a letter that by his own description was the hardest thing he'd written in years, to take a position with a veterans transition nonprofit that had contacted him after the gala. He was not, he wrote in the letter, the right kind of person for the work he'd been doing, and he'd known that for a while but hadn't had the specific evidence until a Saturday night in November that showed him exactly what the right kind looked like. He sent Nathan a brief email. 3 sentences. He said he didn't expect a response. Nathan responded with 2 sentences, which was more than he gave most things, and which Webb said later was the best thing he'd received in his professional life, not because of what it said, but because Nathan Hayes had said it. Spring came to the city the way it always does, tentatively at first, then committed, the trees on the residential blocks coming in green and the evenings staying light a little longer each week. Emma turned 10 in April, in a ceremony of considerable personal significance to her, and Nathan took her and 3 of her friends to a pottery painting place in Brooklyn that left paint on 3 tables and one of the friends and resulted in a lopsided mug that Emma presented to Nathan with the ceremony of someone delivering an object of great worth. He used it every morning. There was a Friday in May, an ordinary Friday, the kind that doesn't announce itself as significant, when Nathan was making dinner and Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework, and the window was open to the spring evening and the city was doing its usual thing outside. Emma looked up from her homework. Dad? Do you think Mom would have liked Ava? He turned from the stove. He looked at Emma, who was looking at him with the direct, honest curiosity of a child who has thought about something for a while and decided to say it. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Ava. He thought about the particular way both of them had of saying exactly what they meant without apologizing for it, and the way both of them had noticed things about people that most people missed, and the way both of them had, at different times and in entirely different contexts, made him feel like the most accurately seen he had ever been. Yeah, he said, I think she would have. Emma nodded and went back to her homework. She said without looking up, I like her. I know you do. Do you? He turned back to the stove. He stirred what he was cooking. Outside, the city went on being itself. The mug with the lopsided handle sat on the counter next to the coffee maker where he'd left it that morning. Yeah, he said. I do. Emma made the small private sound she made when something had gone the way she'd hoped. She said nothing else about it. She went back to her homework. Nathan cooked dinner. The window stayed open. The evening came in. Some things don't need more words than they've already had. Some things are just true, and the truest version of them is the quietest one. Not the version with the stage and the microphone and 400 people watching, but the version at the kitchen table on an ordinary Friday in May, when a father and daughter are just living their life, and the life is not perfect, and it's not finished, and it's not without its weight, but it is, in the most essential sense available to human beings, enough. It is in fact more than enough. It is the thing itself.